For a long time, the saber-tooth felt like a solved mystery. Big cat, long teeth, went extinct. Case closed. Scientists had the bones. They knew the rough timeline. They could look at the skull and draw reasonable conclusions about how it hunted and what it ate. The working assumption was that the saber-tooth was basically a bigger, older version of the cats we have today. Some ancient prototype that eventually evolved into lions and tigers and the rest of the family. It seemed obvious. The size was right. The build was right. The teeth, while extreme, fit the general pattern of a large ambush predator. No one seriously questioned it. Then scientists finally extracted its DNA, and the whole story changed. The comparison they ran was straightforward in principle, even if the execution took years of painstaking lab work. Take the saber-tooth genome. Compare it to every living cat species on Earth. Measure the genetic distances. Find out which living animal is the closest relative. It's the same kind of test that has reshaped our understanding of dozens of other extinct species. Mammoths turned out to be more closely related to Asian elephants than to African elephants. The closest living relative of the hippo turned out to be the whale. In most of these cases, the result is surprising but still makes intuitive sense once you see it. The saber-tooth result was different. It didn't make intuitive sense at first. It required a second look at the entire cat family tree. To run a comparison like this, you need complete genetic profiles of both the extinct species and every living species you're testing it against. Over the past decade, researchers built a detailed genetic database of living cat species, from the largest to the smallest, precisely so that when ancient DNA became available, it could be tested immediately. By 2020, that database was comprehensive enough that the Yukon specimen could be matched against it position by position. Every point in the genome where the saber-tooth's code differed from a living species code was recorded. Add up those differences across thousands of markers, and you get a number, a genetic distance, that places two species in relation to each other with a precision that anatomy alone could never reach. The team ran that calculation against every species in the database. What came back was a ranked list. And the list told a very specific story. Saber-tooth fossils have been coming out of the ground for over a century. The La Brea tar pits in Los Angeles alone have produced thousands of specimens, more saber-tooth bones than probably any other single site on Earth. But having the bones and having the DNA are two completely different things. DNA is a fragile molecule. It breaks down over time, damaged by heat, water, bacteria, and simple chemical decay. A bone that's 10,000 years old has been sitting in conditions that destroy genetic material. For most of scientific history, extracting usable DNA from any fossil that old was considered essentially impossible. What changed was the technology. Over the past 15 years, ancient DNA science went from a niche specialty with limited results to a discipline that routinely sequences genomes from specimens tens of thousands of years old. The key advance was figuring out where in a bone the DNA survives best. Deep inside a dense section of the skull that protects the inner ear, genetic material is shielded from the environment in a way that other parts of the skeleton aren't. Researchers also developed lab techniques for capturing and reassembling the tiny, fragmented pieces of DNA that remain after all that time. In 2020, a team applied all of this to a saber-tooth specimen, the species Homotherium, a saber-tooth that was larger than any modern lion, pulled from the permafrost of the Yukon. What they assembled was the most complete saber-tooth genome ever produced, good enough to run a real comparison against every living cat on the planet. Going into the study, the expectation was fairly clear. Saber-tooths would show up somewhere on the big cat family tree, maybe adjacent to the lineage that produced lions, maybe as a precursor branch to the great cats of Africa and Asia. The skull proportions, the body mass, the dental structure, all of it had always pointed toward a relationship with the largest living cats. This was the consensus view, and it wasn't unreasonable. Scientists had been building evolutionary trees based on anatomy for decades, and the anatomy consistently pointed in the same direction. There was also a broader expectation about how the study would land. Ancient DNA comparisons almost always produce a result that fills a gap. You find the genome, you locate where it sits on the tree, you identify the closest living relative, you explain what that relationship tells us about the extinct species. The story writes itself. The saber-tooth study looked like it would follow the same pattern. The team expected to open the genome and find it sitting close to something large and powerful that would make evolutionary sense. What they actually found broke the pattern entirely. The saber-tooth genome placed the species on its own separate branch, completely isolated from all living cats. Not adjacent to lions, not near tigers, not anywhere that the anatomy had suggested. The split between the saber-tooth lineage and the lineage that produced every living cat happened roughly 20 million years ago, long before any modern cat species had appeared. That's a gap so large it dwarfs most comparisons people are used to hearing. Humans and chimpanzees share a common ancestor from about 7 million years ago. Lions and domestic cats diverged around 10 to 11 million years ago. The saber-tooth and the entire living cat family separated at a point when the planet looked fundamentally different. To make that concrete, a lion and a house cat are different in size, behavior, and habitat, but their DNA carries measurable genetic overlap. They're recognizably from the same family in a way that shows up clearly in the genome. The saber-tooth and a house cat are separated by twice as much evolutionary time as lions and tigers are from each other. Whatever made the saber-tooth what it was, the long teeth, the heavy build, the hunting strategy, it evolved completely independently from the cats we know today. The saber-tooth wasn't a prototype. It was a separate experiment that ran in parallel for millions of years and then ended. It's also worth noting that the saber-tooth's long teeth were not unique to its lineage. At least 3 completely separate groups of mammals independently evolved elongated canines over the course of prehistory. True saber-tooths, an earlier unrelated group called nimravids that are sometimes called false saber-tooths, and a marsupial predator in South America that arrived at the same design through a completely different evolutionary path. The fact that long teeth evolved independently so many times suggests it's a highly effective hunting adaptation for large prey. But each of these lineages ended. None of them left a direct descendant. The design works, apparently, right up until it doesn't. What made the genome comparison strange was what happened when the team measured the genetic distances species by species. Almost every living cat came back with the same result, equally far from the saber-tooth. The distances were remarkably consistent across the board. If you line them all up, there was no obvious winner anywhere in the data, except for one species, where the genetic distance was consistently and measurably smaller than the rest. Not by a dramatic margin, but enough to stand out across every measurement the team ran. That species was the clouded leopard. Most people outside of conservation circles have never heard of it. The clouded leopard lives in the dense forests of Southeast Asia, a medium-sized cat, heavier than a house cat, but considerably lighter than a lion. It's an excellent climber, spending significant portions of its life in the tree canopy, and it has an unusually long tail that helps with balance. In photographs, it looks like a large, heavily spotted domestic cat. Nothing about its appearance would make most people stop and think, this is the most ancient cat alive. But there is one feature that has been setting the clouded leopard apart in scientific literature for decades, long before any DNA work was possible: its teeth. Specifically, its upper canines. Relative to skull size, the clouded leopard has the longest canine teeth of any living cat, proportionally longer than a lion's, proportionally longer than a tiger's. Not as extreme as a saber-tooth, but closer to that end of the spectrum than any other surviving species. Researchers had been informally calling it a living saber-tooth as far back as the 1990s, based purely on tooth geometry and skull measurements. It was an observation, not a conclusion. No one had the genetic data to back it up, until now. There's another feature the clouded leopard has that rarely comes up outside of specialist papers. Its jaw opens wider than any other living cat, to an angle nearly twice that of a lion's. Most cats open to around 65 or 70 degrees. The clouded leopard reaches close to 95 degrees. A saber-tooth needed exactly that kind of extreme range to use its long teeth effectively. A narrow jaw opening would have made the weapons useless. The clouded leopard doesn't have anything close to saber-tooth length canines, but it retained the jaw geometry anyway. It's as if the blueprint for extreme jaw mechanics was preserved in the lineage, even as the teeth themselves became more moderate. That kind of biological echo doesn't prove descent, but it adds texture to what the DNA is also showing. What the genome work did was convert all of these long-standing observations into hard evidence. The clouded leopard's DNA places it at the base of the living cat family tree, the earliest diverging branch of all surviving cat species. Every other cat represents a more recent evolutionary development. In terms of time spent on a separate evolutionary path, the clouded leopard has been independent longer than any other living member of the family. It's the oldest surviving lineage. And because it's the oldest, it's also the one that has drifted the least from the ancestral starting point, the common ancestor it shares, very distantly, with the saber-tooth. The key to understanding why the clouded leopard came up as the closest match is understanding what closest actually means here. The saber-tooth isn't the ancestor of any living cat. There's no direct parent-to-child relationship. What the comparison was measuring was genetic distance from a shared ancestral template. The saber-tooth and all living cats trace back to a single common ancestor that lived roughly 20 million years ago. After that point, the lineage split. One branch became the saber-tooth family, the other branch became every living cat. The question the genome comparison was answering was, which living cat has stayed closest to the original starting point of that second branch? The answer is the clouded leopard, because it was the first species to branch off from that second lineage. Think of it as a tree. At the very base of the trunk, there's the split between saber-tooths and all living cats. Moving up the trunk slightly, the first branch that goes off to the side is the clouded leopard. Everything else continues up the trunk and branches off later. Because the clouded leopard left the main line so early, it carries DNA that's closer to the base of the tree. It has accumulated fewer changes, fewer evolutionary modifications from the ancestral template that the saber-tooth's genome also traces back to. It's not that the clouded leopard hunts like a saber-tooth or shares specific physical adaptations beyond the teeth and jaw. The genetic proximity is fundamentally about time. The clouded leopard took the exit earliest, and that exit was the closest one to where the saber-tooth's road began. In that sense, the clouded leopard is the living animal that gives us the clearest window back to what the cat family looked like before it diversified into everything we know today. Beyond the family tree question, the genome study produced findings about the saber-tooth itself that no fossil could have revealed. The DNA contained signatures for specific biological traits, information that's invisible in bone but preserved in the genetic code. One of the most unexpected was in the vision genes. The saber-tooth carried markers strongly associated with daytime vision, good color perception, high-resolution sight in bright conditions, the kind of visual setup that works best in full daylight. This didn't fit the standard picture of the animal at all. The conventional image of the saber-tooth, built up from fossil sites and anatomical comparisons, was something like a large, solitary predator that ambushed prey from cover, a heavier, more powerfully armed version of a leopard. Ambush hunters in modern ecosystems tend to operate at low light levels, when prey is least alert and vegetation offers the best concealment. The saber-tooth was assumed to fit that pattern. The genome said otherwise. Instead of the gene signatures of a nocturnal stalker, the researchers found the markers of an animal built for activity in open daylight. There were also gene clusters linked to endurance, not the explosive short burst capacity of a sprinting predator, but the sustained, long-distance output of an animal that runs prey down over distance. And there were behavioral markers, gene variants associated with social coordination and group cohesion. Put all of that together, and the picture that emerges is something quite different from the lone ambush predator most people imagine. An animal that hunted in daylight, worked with others, and chased prey rather than waiting for it. In the entire modern cat family, that combination is essentially unheard of. The genome was describing something that didn't behave like any cat alive today. What the behavioral findings do is reframe the extinction. A coordinated group hunter, built for taking down very large prey in the open, has far fewer options when those prey animals vanish than a solitary, flexible ambush predator would. The hunting style that made the saber-tooth so effective at its peak became a constraint when the world changed. The genome isn't just telling us how the saber-tooth lived, it's also telling us, indirectly, why a 42 million year lineage couldn't outlast a rapid shift in the prey available to it. The saber-tooth lineage had one of the longest runs of any predator in the history of land mammals. Different saber-tooth species appeared, diversified, and disappeared over a span of roughly 42 million years. They outlasted countless other predator groups, survived multiple ice ages, and spread across virtually every continent. The last known species died out somewhere between 10,000 and 12,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age. In terms of evolutionary durability, the saber-tooth family was by almost any measure more persistent than the living cat family has been so far. The extinction, when it came, was tied to the collapse of the large herbivores that the saber-tooth had spent millions of years evolving to hunt. Massive, thick-skinned prey animals disappeared in a relatively short window, driven out by a combination of climate change and pressure from human hunters moving into new territories. The saber-tooth's specialization, which had made it extraordinarily effective for so long, became a liability. It couldn't pivot to smaller, faster prey the way a generalist predator might. When the prey was gone, the line ended. No descendants, no living relatives, nothing forward. The clouded leopard, meanwhile, survived. Not because it was obviously tougher or more adaptable. Its range has actually shrunk considerably over the last century, and it's currently listed as vulnerable. But it made it through the end ice age collapse, through the reshaping of the world's forests, through the expansion of humans into every habitat on Earth. The same ancient lineage that branched off earliest from the cat family tree is still here, still climbing trees in the forests of Borneo and Sumatra, still carrying the most archaic surviving version of cat DNA on the planet. That's what gives the clouded leopard result its peculiar weight. The saber-tooth spent 42 million years as one of the dominant predators on Earth and left nothing behind. No lineage, no species that carries its specific adaptations forward. The only windows into all those millions of years of cat evolution are the fossil record, and now, a genome recovered from frozen ground. But sitting in the forests of Southeast Asia, largely unnoticed by anyone outside of wildlife research, is the living cat whose DNA connects most directly to where all of this started. Not a descendant of the saber-tooth, something older and quieter, the branch of the family that stayed closest to the beginning. The scientists who published the study were careful about how they framed this. They weren't claiming descent or direct inheritance. What the data showed was a measurable reduction in genetic distance, a gap that was consistently smaller than for every other living species. When you line up the DNA of every cat alive today against the saber-tooth genome, every result comes back distant, but the clouded leopard's distance is the smallest. Not dramatically, not by a margin that would show up in a casual comparison, but consistently. And consistently is enough when you're dealing with 20 million years of evolutionary time. The saber-tooth is gone. Its 42 million year run came to an end in the same extinction wave that wiped out the mammoths. The closest thing to a window back to that ancient starting point, the animal whose DNA, more than any other living species, still connects to where all cats began, is a spotted, tree-climbing cat in Southeast Asia that most people couldn't name. That's the result. That's what the genome study found. And it's stranger than anything anyone predicted going in.